Hello, my name is Rory McKiernan and you're very welcome to the Love and Courage podcast. A big thanks to all you wonderful patrons who chip in to power the podcast, which helps it reach listeners in over 50 countries all over the world. If you want to chip in, just head over to loveandcourage.org. All support is appreciated, including sharing, rating and reviewing the podcast. And a reminder that you can find me, Rory McKiernan, on Twitter, Instagram, various social media channels, Facebook and so on. And I have an email newsletter. It's quite an occasional newsletter and you can sign up over at loveandcourage.org. Also, this episode is a great conversation with Noeline Blackwell. Noeline is someone whose work I've admired for a long time. She is the CEO of the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. She has worked for several decades as a solicitor and previously as Director General of FLAC, the Free Legal Advice Centres. She's a powerful voice for change in so many areas of society, not least sexual violence. This is a topic close to my heart as I've seen so many people affected by it. People of different genders, ages and backgrounds. It's so prevalent, and whether we realise it or not, it reaches into all corners of society. I don't think it's something that can be ignored. Myself and my friend Molly Sterling recently ran an event on this topic in collaboration with Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. It was called What Needs to Change as a question, and it was attended by over 200 people from all over the world. It was an online event. One of the more important aspects of the conversation for me was the question of how do we get more men involved in the conversation and the actual culture change that is so necessary, right from the social conditioning that goes on in childhood, the repression of emotions, the challenges and barriers to seeking help when needed, the everyday remarks and behaviours that lead to more serious issues. There's so many areas that need to be discussed, and ultimately I think change that is necessary, change is a win-win for everyone, and that needs to be embraced. So all of this is something I discuss now with Noeline in our conversation, and I do want to say, perhaps needless to say, do go easy on yourself if you find this subject matter difficult, and please do reach out for help if you need it. There's so much more to this conversation also, including a fascinating insight into Noeline's upbringing and great stories about her grandfather also, Brian Ryan. What a great name. Brian sounded like a fascinating character, so you'll hear about him as well. So without further ado, let's jump in. I hope you enjoy this Love and Courage conversation with Noeline Blackwell. Noeline, you're very welcome to the Love and Courage podcast. Thanks for joining me on the podcast. How are you keeping?
Great. Thanks very much, Rory. It's a real pleasure. I'm delighted to be talking to you on this podcast and kind of to get a chance maybe to look at things a little bit differently to the way I'd normally be looking at it. So, it's always the to-do list, all the things you have to get done in a day. And talking to you, I know is going to be just a little bit of reflection that I'm going to enjoy, and kind of getting your always very loving and courageous view on things as well. So it's a great pleasure. Thank you.
You're very kind. Starting off with all these compliments will get you everywhere now. Thank you. But I do agree with that sense of the importance of reflection and reflective space, particularly for those that are involved in activism and doing and action, that sometimes we're so full flight that to take a step back, even for an hour, to have a look at it, or even to re-question ourselves, can be very useful, because we're kind of often operating on assumptions, and the assumptions can change in time as well. And do you find that in general, Noeline, that just that reflective space is missing, or do you think that it is inbuilt in your particular work because of the particular nature of the work that you do now, that it lends itself to reflection? Or where are you at with all that?
Yeah, I don't. I think every job that's busy can get very task focused. And we're doing this podcast on a Monday, and there's something about the list you have to make on a Monday that you know yourself you're not going to achieve by the end of the week, but still you feel the need to start all over again with tasks. But actually, just at the moment, I think there is a lot of interest in reflection, and it's really important in some ways when I get a chance like this, it reminds me that whatever I'm not getting done off my to-do list, I'm still getting something done. And, I'm reminded about some things that maybe just, oh, if they don't get done, it's not going to be the end of the world, because everyone is traveling, in some sort of positive way. And that reflection is normally, for me, it is normally positive. I get to remember that we are that we're all trying our best to make a better society, and it's nice to be able to not sort of wallow in it or not kind of be complacent about it, but just to recognize that there is value in what we're doing, and that's why it's nice to take an hour off. And we kind of miss them. Apart from things like podcasts, one of the things, certainly I think, and you will have come across this as well, during the restrictions of the pandemic, where more and more meetings were online. Definitely we did good meetings, we got good work done, but there wasn't that kind of 5 minutes when I'd bump into you walking into the meeting, or we'd walk out together and say, wow, wasn't that an interesting perspective? And didn't we make progress? Or even, why didn't we make progress?
Yeah.
So it's really nice. I appreciate these opportunities.
Yeah. There's a term that sometimes used about the idea of the spaces in between the spaces. And I think that when you get into this kind of what can be almost an industrialized version of working, and for whatever reason, even people in civil society have inherited often an industrial model of task orientation. And I think I've often seen with the philanthropic funders sometimes, at least in the past, sort of encouraged the logic model format of thinking, so that our entire days or weeks can be based on a spreadsheet that X input equals X output equals X outcome. And social change just doesn't really work exactly that formulaic. And I think there's the beauty of the spaces in between. Imagine if we left a little gap in the spreadsheet for those conversations. And I think, you can almost be guaranteed that some positive reflection or insight or idea or innovation will emerge out of those spaces, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, you need to have both, actually. You need to have the worker bee, and I think that's my normal place, is get in and do something, make something, build something, get something done. And then, but the magic is often in the chat, that those in between places. And we're kind of in between times as well. So even more to be able to kind of hear, it's not all going to be this way. Now, I have to say, the Zoom meetings were a fantastic way of getting through this. I just miss that little bit of the chance statement, the person who wasn't heard in the meeting, the person whose point was gone by the time their hand was noticed on the thing, because that's the way they operate a little bit differently. And even just the chat you'd have with the person beside you when somebody else was talking. So those are all good as well. And all of those help reflection as well. And we do need that reflection, because especially working in the area of civil society, as you have done for so long, and I mean, you do think big, you do think long along the way, and it's I see that in all your endeavors. But at the same time, like it's sometimes hard to see the progress being made. It's hard to validate your own actions and your colleagues' actions, unless you kind of say, is it worth our while? Because if it isn't, we should stop doing it and just enjoy the sunshine.
Yeah. I think you're onto something very big there and very important. Particularly like the Monday morning or the Monday planning day and the ever growing list of tasks. And then, do we sufficiently make space on a Friday to reflect on actually what was achieved? Because
Yeah,
inevitably there is a huge amount being, we have many failures, let's say, if we call them failures. But at the same time, there are so many interactions and things being achieved that sometimes cannot or will never be captured. And the conversation or the helpline
yeah,
answered, or the person that was referred to counseling or whatever it might be, that many of those things
yeah,
ripple on and on. And I suppose at some level it's up to each and every one of us on an individual level to have that deep knowing that this matters and this is working, but to also
yeah.
challenge it to make sure we're not just on a vanity project clapping ourselves on the back saying well done
That
when it
is
isn't working.
that is so that is so important as well. That we don't that we're not complacent, that we are world saviors or something if you're working in, say, the community and voluntary sector. I don't notice that, actually. I think most people working in the area don't have that view of themselves as being kind of world saviors. Everybody, that most people that I meet, in fact, I don't know anyone that I meet that is otherwise. But the people I meet are all satisfied that they have skills uh, and talents and energy that can just be well used in the advancement of a better society.
Yeah.
And I think that's absolutely fantastic. I mean, that can be abused as well, of course, by somebody saying, well, of course, if you're that interested in it, you should do it for nothing, or you should do it for lower pay than somebody who is building armaments or something. So there's scope for that to be misunderstood as well. But most people that I have worked with over the umpty dump years that I've been active in one thing or another are really just sort of saying, I have something to give here, and I think I could make life a little bit better for
Yeah.
all of us if we did it. Yeah.
Well, I certainly think, anyone that had particular godly notions about themselves, they're not going to last that long, really. Maybe
No.
the odd one will get through. But the other thing is, from a financial perspective, it's not exactly the most lucrative or rewarding space, So the rewards are many and multiple, but I definitely have a strong sense, particularly just listening to what you said, that of the vocational drive and dedication of people, that it really is sort of life work that people take on. I don't even think that people maybe see it as a career. You know what I mean? It's what you do, but they're all deeply personal decisions that will have led people into that kind of work.
Yeah. Yeah, but just kind of to talk against myself there, I think people should be able to think of it as a career and as a worthwhile career. We need people working in the community and voluntary sector who aren't just really good at health services. We need people who are really good at IT, who are really good at finance.
Yeah.
There's such. It should be possible for somebody to say, I want to be a lawyer or an IT person in the community and voluntary sector in somewhere, or I just have these skills. I want to be paid properly and I want to go into the community and voluntary sector as well. Not necessarily that it's even where they'll spend the rest of their lives, but that it should be just a great job as well. We give them job satisfaction and we give them proper pay. And, just to get my little moan in early about that, we in the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre and elsewhere as well, our organisation, other rape crisis centres and many others took really vicious cuts to funding, which was already too small, but took huge cuts to funding during the recession. And to this day, important state services that we provide have not been revalued at the rate in which somebody would, if they were working in the same job in a state agency. Now, we're just doing a job that government has outsourced to us. And I think they're right to outsource to us because we know how to do the job well and we have experts doing those jobs. But we are not rated in the same way as, say, a public servant would be when it comes through our remuneration. So it's a constant kind of, just a concern that the services we provide to some of the most vulnerable people in our society, some of the people in need of help, where, and it's not maybe so much the case now, but where nobody else would even listen to them in terms of people who experienced rape and sexual abuse. And that still there wasn't that recognition that needed to be respectfully funded, decently funded. I'm not saying massively funded, just respectfully funded. Now, I do think government, TUSLA, the Department of Justice, have become much more conscious over the period of the pandemic and in this current government of the jobs that we do. But still there is that bottom line that says, maybe they'll do it anyway because they have a vocation. Nurses will say the same thing to you, and they're public servants. Yeah, so it's not right, is it? That's not fair.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there, very much so, from the point of view that maybe they'll do it anyway, and the chances are that, that level of vocationalism can lead itself to exploitation. And sometimes also it's up to us to be self-aware of that we have to actually at some point push back.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps also, the idea of civil society collective voice is necessary there, but that can also get lost in the mix because we're so busy trying to firefight and keep the show on the road. Where do we get the space for the extra advocacy energy that's required to fight for that? So it's chicken and egg type scenarios.
But even with that, you see, I think that charities do people like to feel the Charities Institute make these points, and they're member organizations, and we row in with them and they do it. But it has to come from the person who's the piper. And like the pipe, I can't actually, I lose the piper, Rory, because I think I might have the wrong thing of that particular little thing about paying the piper. But it's just that in some ways we know, and the voluntary sector continuously says this, that you have reviewed everyone else's pay post and conditions post the recession. You have recognized that people were hard done by, but the community and voluntary sector are at the end of the pie because we're not in government. Of our nature, we're not in government. We're not making the decisions. We're providing the services. We're doing the analysis. We're giving government the information that they need to make good decisions. We clearly are doing work that they now recognize as important, but just not valuing it in the way that other work is valued. Anyway, we'll keep fighting on it, I think, because it's just not, we lose people, at a time of inflation, all of these, we lose good people who would be great.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I like what you're saying about embracing the positive aspect of seeing the career potential there, because the reality is that people do have livelihoods and mortgages and families and educations and all these other needs. So whilst the vocational thing is very noble and is to be celebrated, there's also a hard, cold reality there. And I was just reflecting on this in a conversation with Social Justice Ireland, that there are so many salaries I see continue to be advertised in the community and voluntary sector for 25 to 30,000 euro a year. And they were the same salaries that I remember seeing 20 years ago, and they haven't really changed. Now, if you're 20, 25, 30, 35, and you're renting at the moment, then you can't almost afford to work in the community or voluntary sector to some extent. So there's a bigger question there, but I'm conscious that we could drive this whole conversation into industrial relations. But I want to go back to you, and I really suspect that you probably don't want to talk about yourself, but I'm going to have a go anyway. But this kind of, you mentioned that you have the worker bee tendency, and that's evident, by all you've achieved over the years. You don't get to achieve things without a certain amount of push and drive and dedication. But I'm just wondering where that perhaps became first evident in your life. Was that a childhood characteristic, or was that something that emerged later on? If somebody was looking back on you and did a bit of a psychoanalysis as you growing up, were there characteristics that were evident?
Well, one of the things I am is I'm the eldest of three girls, and so that brings with it, I'm absolutely convinced. Where are you in the family? Where are you?
I'm the eldest, yeah.
All right, okay. And I hope you don't mind my saying so. Then it brings about a certain bossiness, I do think, and a certain tendency.
Speak for yourself
to say,
there.
yeah. Well, just saying, it's the way I've seen it.
Okay.
But so I think there is. So maybe that's one part of it. I certainly would not have, excelled or been shown to be a driving force in relation to anything. Useless at sports, happiest with a book, managed to go under the radar in school to a great extent, and came out with adequate, but by no means brilliant results all along the way. So, but I actually think that maybe for me and everyone in my family as well, like really there was no doubt. But that you were expected to do something, you're expected to get on with doing something with your life, but where it, I like then when I finished school, I became a solicitor, and it was in the old days where you could become a solicitor at the same time as you did a degree, so I could do it kind of cheaply, and I could do it by the time I was very young. And I absolutely love law, and I love all the work associated with that. Law has been a good discipline for me all my life. And then I suppose I've always had the sense, the only thing really that you could say, if I was asked what's my philosophy, I'd have to say I've never really grown up from when I was 3 or 2 or whatever age it is that kids start saying it's not fair. So I think I started saying it's not fair. And I don't know that I've advanced a whole lot since then either over the decades, because that's still the driver. And then I suppose once you find the things that are worth achieving or worth pursuing, then it's easier to work for them as well. And I've been very extraordinarily lucky in life that I've had things that both in my, say, day job and in my interests that I felt were worth achieving and worth working for. So that's it. Yeah. So I work hard, I think. Mm.
So that little 2 or 3 year old that was that was shouting it's not fair about whether it be the slice of the cake or whatever it might be. Maybe that's where like the socialism begins in the household, with this who gets what slice of the cake. But where do you feel that the social justice drive was almost like inherently in your DNA, or was there an influence from the household, from the family in any way, or even the community?
I grew up in rural County Tipperary and then in Tipperary town, and my family, a lot of the chat in the family was political chat, and my mother worked outside the home at a time that not every mother did, and was a member of a union, and my father was very interested in, he ran a small creamery and very interested in the cooperative movement and things like that. So, there was an air about the place, all right, that we were, my grandfather liked it, was writing books which more or less went nowhere about his time during the Civil War. So like there was an air in which we were conscious of the wider world. And I think we were always taught that how it was not a given that you'd grow up in a secure house where there was an income coming into it, and food coming into it on a regular basis, and the same roof over your head week after week. I think we were all very conscious of that. So it must have been in the house, must have been. And my wider family as well can be very politically active, and the rows can be good at weddings and things like that. But yeah, so I'd say it was there from the start. But to be honest, I managed to saunter through my early years, my college years, and even after college, without actually getting involved in anything at all other than having the best of fun. So it was, I think then maybe later, maybe first thing was in Tipperary, they set up a Citizens Information Centre, which at the time, now I've had later dealings with them when I was in FLAC, the Free Legal Advice Centres, but a Citizens Information Centre in Tipperary town back in the late 70s or early 80s. I don't know when it was started exactly, I just can't remember. But it was an extraordinary thing that someone could just go into the volunteers that we were involved in it and ask something about their social welfare, and that you didn't owe anyone a vote after it. Because before that, the politicians managed all that kind of thing. And now you learn that your entitlement to social welfare was a right, or your housing application was a right. Yeah. So, that was really, I think in some ways, I keep forgetting about how influential all of those centres were. And they set up everywhere. They were in every town around the country. And lots of them, like we were in Tipperary at the time, run by volunteers. It's just it was a brilliant movement. Now they've in more recent years, they've consolidated and they're more professional and all the rest of it. But even to this day, if I want information, it's the Citizens Information website I go on to.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I share that view. And I grew up in a small rural town in Cavan, and there was very little information available about anything. In some ways, it was the next stage on from the mono society, just pre-internet, if you like. And I suppose, every now and then I'd go to Dublin 2 hours on a bus on a Saturday or whenever it was. But I remember first encountering a youth information centre and going in, and they had leaflets and information on. So even now I'm starting to reflect, well, it's no shock that I went on to set up youth information services and so on. But the power of information to me as a curious 15 or 16-year-old, knowing that there was way more out there than what I was being told, and just this basic tenet that information is power. And to this day, I would use citizensinformation.ie, and I think it's actually an incredible service. And I think sometimes, we can kind of... We have an expectation perhaps on very glamorous activism, or it needs to be big and bold and wild. And the simple things are often the things that get the job done, aren't they? The phone number or the helpline or whatever. Yeah,
they were absolutely, that is 100% right. And later when I worked with FLAC, the Free Legal Advice Centres, the fact that these information centres as well often had volunteers, solicitors and barristers rocking up once a week or once a month in there, and you could go in with the solicitor's letter that was making you nervous to the pit of your stomach, or the question you had about the rights, your rights as a parent or as even as a child, anything you liked, that you could just ask these questions and that somebody would answer them there as well. So it's just, to my mind, like FLAC wasn't is an access to justice organisation. And the first part of access to justice is access to information, decent information, because without it, people can really bully you and disrespect you. Whereas, it's just great. Yeah, so they were a great organisation, and still are. Yeah, and still in Tipperary. Yeah.
I'm tempted to go off on a rant here. I've got an itch, but just one thing that keeps coming to mind, it's another pet peeve, is when politicians continually and regularly announce the grants that are coming to the local community for the sports club or the school or whatever. And the fact that is like you and I know that this is information that it's part of the normal running of a normal society or normal state, but they use the wheels of information and they get out and announce it early. And so I mean, it's another version of media to an extent that who's controlling the narrative in many ways. But as I said, I'm kind of ranting off on pet peeves, and this is about you, not me, so I need to be careful. But I want to go back, Noeline, to your to Tipperary, and particularly you mentioned your grandfather writing those books, and can you tell me more about what you might remember from your grandfather, or any stories or?
Well, we were very lucky in our family that my mother's father lived with us, and he was, we considered, our ally against the common enemy of the parents. So he was a great grandfather. Like some grandfathers are better than others. He was the Carlsberg of grandfathers at the time, but he was out during the time of the Troubles in 1918-19. Actually, I see that in Hollyford, which is where he lived and where I lived in my early life as well. They're having, as part of, this decade of remembrance, they're having an event in May to recognize the importance of the burning of the barracks by the old IRA. So they're having that in May, and they're going to mention his book there because he mentions that in the book as well. So it was just actually he was just one of the he had lots of stories about his friends. He ended up he started going to agricultural college, and then his father died suddenly, and he couldn't get to finish, so he didn't get to be an agricultural instructor, which he would have loved to be. But he had to come home and kind of farm beside a mountain. I have heard this before. Well, yeah, I mean, it was poor land. Yeah, you couldn't say any otherwise. Even though in the County Tipperary everyone thinks all the land is great, but it wasn't. This was poor land. And he had to do that. But what he had was a great observant eye about family, friends, and about the local community. And I think what we used to love when we were small was he'd go down the town when we moved to Tipperary town, and he'd chat to someone, and you'd get the gossip like for 10 or 15 minutes. Not big stories, but just he was very observant about people. He used to take us to the mart. Now, there was a cattle mart on our street once a week, and a pig mart as well. On a Wednesday, the pig mart, Friday, the cattle mart. And we would go, and he'd take us sometimes because he was still interested in the cattle even after he retired. And he made us believe that if we as much as moved a muscle in the yard, we'd have bought a cow for ourselves, and that we'd have to pay for it, and we didn't have enough money to pay for it. It was one of the best forms of babysitting I ever saw. It was like just he was mischievous, a bit like that as well.
He sounds
so
like
he was just he was a good character and a great support in the house as well, and lovely connection to an Ireland that moved very fast on him as well. He died in the 1970s. He died the same month as Devanera, and they were kind of an age and an era, and they were all dying off at that stage. So, but he was very clear he was old IRA. He was not the IRA of even the 30s, 40s, or 50s. Yeah.
I got that sense, from talking about him and his books and the Civil War and the trade unionism in the house and the co-op, and then your own work. Like it strikes me as a Republican influence, like republicanism in its positive form.
Yeah. I would say that was right. Now it was Fianna Fáil all the way now, just in case, and it was a quizzical Fianna Fáil kind of thing. There was So, but definitely very conscious of the state and the value of the state, and he taught us all the old patriotic songs that I'd say I could still sing if I had to. Yeah, along the way. We knew them better than we do our hymns, I'm sorry to say. Yeah.
And did you ever have any kind of, flirtations or interactions with any dabbling in any politics or parties or groups or anything like that yourself, if you don't mind me asking?
No, not at all. Not at all. And in some ways, I just think like how privileged my life has been that I found this kind of third sector, rather, which suits me very nicely indeed. And I have to say, I have the greatest of respect for anybody who will join a political party and who will seek to advance that political party, particularly for those who will stand in front of somebody else and ask them for a vote. I think it is. I think it's a very brave thing to do, and I think it's a very public spirited thing to do as well. I think I may once have joined some one of the political parties in my first year in college, when I went around
I'd say
on the first day joining everything. But if you were to ask me which it was, I have no idea which one it would have been along the way. Maybe it was actually Fine Gael, because that was the time where you had Declan Costello and the Just Society and Gareth Fitzgerald and all of those. Looked like there were a lot of smart. But I never went to a meeting, and I'm only declaring it in the event that somebody once says that they knew I was in a political party for a wet week. But I've no recollection what it is.
This is where you get to control the narrative, Noeline, and we'll do the big reveal here. This is My Secret Life as a Blue Shirt by Noeline Blackwell.
Oh, yeah. No, thank you very much indeed. But I do think, Rory, that for you and me, in some ways, we have great, flexibility or great permission to be very clear about what it is that we stand for and how we will go after it and the rest of it. Whereas people who become local or national politicians are often asked to make compromises, which make it extremely difficult. Now, I'm not saying that they couldn't improve their own country sometimes along that way, but just my hat is off to anyone who will do that. And who will recognize that as a result of, what you have to, I suppose, accept or what you have to deal with is not always why you came into politics. So, I do think they're great.
I think that's very insightful and also compassionate. And I think, many of us on a particularly on a bad day will have our rants and raves and so on, but it can be a very, very tough life, and we do need people, and increasingly need good people to go into that fray, and we in many ways need to encourage and support them while they're in it.
Yes.
I saw one county councillor or city councillor in Limerick resigned recently for his mental health, but not just his mental health. He was also in fear of his personal safety because he was getting involved in community work that involved drugs, gangs and so on. And in the end, he said he had a breakdown and that he's a counsellor with a I, not a counsellor, as in a therapist counsellor. And he was not prepared for that. And I think we could probably all benefit a lot from encouraging and building supports around a more compassionate society from top down and up, down, top down and all around. Like to have because the danger then is also they can become very hardened, and you see that loss of humanity can occur, particularly as the system grinds people down. And it's one of the things I've noticed about, there's a handful of politicians I see or have met over the years that they would still have a lot of, I'm talking about an older generation, they've been at it for a long time, but they still have a great warmth about them. And I think it's an amazing thing for anyone to do in any field, whether it be politics, civil society or business or anywhere else, is to keep that warmth about you. It's an important thing because life can wear you down a bit.
Yeah. And you can become very cynical and you can become very focused on just what will get you through the day. But actually, I think that's right. Now, neither is that to say, though, that like politics, we do need to support the ones who are doing their best, who are really focusing in on the needs in our society. And so I think that's important. But I think politicians themselves need to be less cynical sometimes as well about us, the voters.
Yeah, well, I mean, look at it. There's so many examples of how we're constantly ahead of the game in terms of the electorate being ahead of the politicians on multiple issues. Yeah. That you talked about cynicism there, and just I think sometimes it's inevitable or understandable that people can grow cynical because they're waiting for change on a variety of issues. For instance, health reform or housing or the environment or whatever. But particularly, I'm thinking of your own current work and or even your previous work around justice and law reform and FLAC and so on. But around sexual violence, I find it. I often consider what it must be like to work day in, day out on it, because I've only ever had small things to do with trying to be of some support, but it's such an emotional space. It's such a harrowing space. It almost reveals some of the worst that humanity has to offer, and perhaps some of the best in the response. But I would imagine that it requires a very well developed inner space to hold out any cynicism, to keep that hope alive. Does that make any sense?
It makes sense, but it's missing the value that working in this area can bring, and that is that at least you can do something about it. It is a very tough area, and I have to be the first to say before all my staff and volunteers come and say it for me, I don't get the hard end of the stick. I don't provide the services directly. We have really brilliant therapists, counsellors, supporters, accompanying people through court and police, as well as on their inner journeys in terms of their healing, in terms of being there 24/7 through amazing volunteers who train really hard and take a lot of supervision to be available, out of office hours, to be there just when people need them. So it's very much service driven. And then we have a whole other group of people who are kind of supporting that. So like I was saying, the IT, the finance, the administration, all of these people who are saying this has to work because we can help people. And that's what I find. I mean, we do put in place structures to make sure that people have ways of, downloading and being heard, and that they get kind of supervision to ensure that they're managing, that they're coping okay. But from what I know from everybody that I work with and that I've worked with, it is that business, at least we're getting to do something about this, because there's nothing worse than feeling this is an awful problem and that there's nothing I can do about it. And I will say this, that it has been worse. We had just before the pandemic hit, we marked the 40th anniversary of the setting up of the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre. And because it was set up by a bunch of very visionary young women, they were all loads of them still around, 40 years later, which is the value of setting up an organisation for young people, like yourself and Spun Out and things like that. You can still be around with all the anniversaries later on. But what they went through is massive compared to what we have to put up with. Like, they were setting up a helpline for those who experienced rape and sexual abuse at a time where you weren't even allowed to mention these words. And at a time where if they made a comment to the paper, it had to be anonymous because they wouldn't want their work to know they were involved in it, or their families wouldn't want them to be saying they were involved in it. It was considered a dirty, shady, shameful business to be helping someone who was a victim of rape or sexual abuse or sexual harassment, or trying to change the system. And you know what? I think I've been very lucky. I'm in the job over 6 years now, but I stand on the shoulders of a whole lot of absolutely brilliant people before me who slogged through those times where you were not allowed to mention it. Like, I still kind of say, just remember that 31 years ago, it was a perfect defense for a man to say that the woman he raped was his wife. So we have been very slow. It's been very slow to talk about it. I know you can't talk about it everywhere yet. There will be places where this will not be discussed at all. And I know that even for people who would like to discuss it, it can be very hard still. But the era we are in now is one where you and loads of other people are all perfectly happy to have me on. I'm on loads of podcasts, but you're prepared to do a podcast with me without worrying. Will this upset the majority of people? Without the Minister for Justice will come out and say, we have to fix this. The head of TUSLA will say it. The president will say it. So there's at a level, we are at a level where what was totally hidden and considered shameful and wrong to speak about, our society has moved on from that, and it makes it much easier to have conversations and to have productive conversations. To say these are some of the solutions that are needed, and to say to people, these are the services, they're here for you. Feel free to use them in whatever ways there. So in some ways, the big reveal in the past decade for me has been the way that you can speak about sexual violence. Domestic violence more as well. But sexual violence, I think, was an absolute no-no. And I definitely think that the internet, digital media, and Me Too and all the variations of Me Too have meant that we're not going to have what happened 40 years ago, where women were doing all these marches when the Rape Crisis Centre was set up. They were out marching saying, I want to walk where I want to wear what I want without being physically or sexually assaulted. And then it disappeared back again into the background. I don't know. I mean, nothing is sure, but I doubt we'll be able to push these hidden violences back into their box, which is, I know, what some people would still like. So, and that's valuable. And we've got to make the best of that. While it's out there, we've got to actually move. We've got to have it recognized that we have to get to a place where society no longer tolerates sexual violence. We have to get to a place where people who carry it out are stopped. And we have to get to a place where people who need services don't feel ashamed to use them.
Yeah, that I'm really I'm struck by that sort of visual of those pioneers, if you like, and trailblazers, the people that, because these are probably women that were, maybe they were working, or maybe they were rearing a family at home, or whatever, or or both, and a lot of this happening in the evening in a semi-clandestine, revolutionary sort of a way. And I do think it's important to situate and contextualize it in the culture, which in many ways was such a harsh and repressive culture, and certainly not a culture where women were in positions of any great authority at any large scale. And that, for me, has to be one of the fundamental game changers here, is that if we can ensure a crossing of the line where women are in power in every facet of society as should be normal, then we maybe won't be dealing with many of these problems, because the power imbalance that ripples out in very many forms of abuse, not just sexual violence or abuse, can be addressed. But I suppose the but there is that I do feel like we're crossing into new eras. But I suppose maybe I'll hold a but, because like your grandfather or your parents, I'm sort of like, don't take you use the words, it's not a given, like I do think it's a given, but I there's almost that vigilance there to like,
Yes.
it's not done till it's done sort of thing.
Yes. And I think that's right. And you see, I think it's partly all right, women being in decision-making places. But in terms of this, there's the added complication that everybody wanted not to talk about the imbalance between people in a relationship, between men and women in this area. It was, in some ways, it was an imbalance, and it was an inequality between women and men, but that everything conspired to make it the norm. So, I often say the books I read when I was young, oh my goodness, now they would so not look right to read. I think the same is probably true of old films. Sometimes you look at them and you go, oh, good film, but you wouldn't do that now.
Yeah.
Our literature over thousands of years, our songs. So we have to. So it's a conversation that everyone is caught in their stereotypes. Not just.
Yeah.
It's not just kind of a thing of once off. Everyone has to rethink, what does equality look like in the area of sexual behavior, sexual activity. It is. We're kind of getting to a stage where people begin to understand that it's not enough to say, if somebody is upset by something, it's not enough to say, that's only banter, I didn't mean it. You have to recognize the impact on somebody as well. But I think we do have to spend a bit of time and be careful in dealing with people who are brought up either to accept that these kind of things will be said about them and they have to brush them off, or people who think it's a compliment to pass remarks in a particular way, and really have to rethink as well that this person, would I say this to an equal? Well, the answer probably is no. But how do we do that? And it's kind of why we've said in the Rape Crisis Centre, we know forever that the opposite of sexual abuse is respectful, consensual behavior. Like it's nearly that simple in some ways, and still that's really hard, because while we have our own view on what that is, people are brought up in certain ways. Even within the one culture, people can be brought up in very different streams of thinking, and we really need to have what we're calling this national conversation with people at all areas, in all spaces, to see what is it that's like, what's not to love about what I'm saying. I think it's just so good for everyone. If we can find that consensual, respectful behavior in this area is in everyone's interest. And that's why we're going to put a whole lot of time and effort and money into this. We're looking at getting funders in to help us with it. But because we did a survey last year, which, like the headline finding was that 70%, and it wasn't survey, it was proper research. Language, Adam May in Language and others would be horrified if I called it just a survey. It was properly thought through public awareness and attitudes research, which found that 70% of those surveyed identified that there was a problem with consent in the area of sexual behavior and activity. But it was always someone else's problem, So we know there's an issue there. We know as a people, but nobody has quite unlocked, or not enough of us have unlocked it to a stage where we get to a place where we are actually in some other areas as well. Like, I'm sure there are still some people who think it's not a good thing for women to be going out to work. But you'd be very slow to say that now in mixed company without knowing who you were talking to, because it's just not acceptable anymore.
Yeah, I think it's a line in the sand on which we cross, and there's no going back. Absolutely. I do think we're at that tipping point, but we need to tip it over. And I suppose that's the work, and it always has been the work. And I suppose for me, there are remaining questions over men's role in the work as to, the continual plea and call and demand and invitation and every other way of putting it that men need to shape up here. And, I suppose it has provoked a lot of self-reflection myself, because, I'm no different than any other guy in that, well, we're all different and unique, but I grew up with a variety of influences, some positive, some negative, and you pick up the cracks, and then you have to, in some ways, the term that's coming to mind and listening to you speak was decolonization, of gender, almost sort of like strip back a lot of what we think we might know as just a given.
Yeah.
And But beyond gender, then into sexuality and sex as a loving, intimate, beautiful part of the human experience, other than what is too often seen as a dominant, violent, aggressive, conquestual way of looking at the world, which I think is mirrored then in economic systems and how we treat the earth and so on and so forth. So for me, it's a game changer at every level that we're looking at. And I think the promise at the other end of that is just spectacular. Like it can transform everything.
Fantastic. I mean, that's what we hope out of this. There's no loss, but there is still that reconception, that reframing is undoubtedly has to happen. But hopefully then it will not just be in this area, that it increases our understanding of respect and equality as a society as well. And that's why we were really pleased that the convention, the Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality, actually pointed out and said, until we have an end, well, I suppose not an end, they didn't put it quite like this, until we deal effectively with sexual, domestic and gender-based violence, we cannot have gender equality. So it's like, it's cut into everything. It is cut into everything. And men and boys, all the genders are as cut in it and as constricted by the old concepts as any other. So it's not just, this isn't just for the advancement of women, but the change. It's where you said there, you've had the chat about, you've had to think about this yourself. You have. I bet you're one of the first in the country, and I bet you've had several. But actually, I think a lot of people have not yet. And the reason you don't is the reason why, for instance, I don't notice some things myself either. In this area, I'm very alert. I work in the area. But I'm perfectly sure, given who I am, with all the privileges I was born to, in this current time, that there is inequality and discrimination. I just don't see. I just don't notice it. So I have to listen. And sometimes I know I will have heard of something 20 times, and the 21st time it'll hit home. So that's why we need to keep talking. We can pass over people like yourself, or we can expect you to go off and do your own piece. But there's a whole lot, I think, of challenges left where people literally, it just hasn't hit them. There was a lovely man sent me a message after the tragic murder of Ashley Murphy and the concurrent debate that raised around women's safety simply by virtue of their gender. He sent me something saying, he said, I'm going to have to be much more careful about the banter. And then he said, but I'm going to also have to be more careful of where I stand and where my shadow is. And I think that's kind of nice, that question of the shadow, because we all come with our assumptions, and none of us really find it that easy to change them, or most of us don't find it that easy to change them, because that requires adjustment. It might be, in the long term, it might be a good thing. It's kind of like giving up chocolate. Maybe it's good for you, but like it's kind of the pain. It's not the same. I mean, it's totally different, but you know, and it's easier not to change sometimes, I think.
It's a really powerful and interesting way of putting it, that where you would cast your shadow, because I suppose by virtue of being alive and speaking and walking and talking, or whatever way we imprint upon the world, we do cast a shadow. And I suppose it's maybe to reflect and be aware of how we are in the world, you know? And like, I suppose that for me transcends almost sexuality. And it's the word that I often come back to in all of this conversation is about power, and how we understand ourselves as someone with power or without power. But even what you talked about there about, you know, whether it be your upbringing or your privileges or your job or your role, like as with yourself, like we can never assume that we're the full piece of work here, that we've all of this figured out, because we might be messing it up at the other side of the house. And I think just to keep that degree of kind of humility, and also to be constantly open to growing and learning. And I think maybe that does get lost sometimes in the understandable debate that goes on, particularly after a tragedy or a horrific crime or assault, that there's a lot of trauma and hurt and woundedness, and these kind of nuances can get smashed up, and I understand perfectly why they would be. But how do we create a civil society, compassionate but firm space to get stuck in and challenge each other and bring, but at the same time, challenge each other where we don't have to throw each other into the sea, kind of thing, you know?
Yes, that's right. Because that's what we found was happening when we started having our conversation. Or I mean, not started, but I suppose when we were thinking about how to advance the conversation, what we found was that some people accepted the thing and actually helped us understand it better. Some people were absolutely, utterly uninterested, and that may be the case. But an awful lot of men became defensive about it. So you get that kind of that not all men thing, which is of course true. Not all men are engaged in violence against women. Not all men are disrespectful of women or of other men or whatever. But the reality was the defensiveness is part we're trying to get away from, so that people don't feel they have to go into their box in order to understand that maybe what we all thought 5 years ago, 15 years ago, 30 years ago is no longer a thinking. Because if we do think that, if we think we've learned nothing over 30 years, then that's kind of a sad sign for all of us as well. Whereas in fact, we're all growing. And our society has grown. Irish society has grown in some really interesting ways. So sometimes I go back over the various improvements that have happened to the lot of women, particularly if I'm talking to young women who can get very disappointed at the slow rate of change. And they certainly want to give me a kick and tell me get on with it a little bit faster than I am. And then I go back to the quote that, I'm sorry, Rory, but I've probably told you this before, but the quote from a judge in the High Court in Dublin in the 1970s, when this fellow was suing, his name was Werner Brown. He was suing Stanley Roach because Stanley was having an affair with his wife. And the judge, and actually Stanley Roach and the wife totally agreed they were having an affair. So there was no need to go to court for that. It was only to assess how much damages that the cuckolded husband could get. And the judge said to the jury, a wife is a chattel, just like a cow or a thoroughbred horse. And while that is actually correct in law as it was back in the 1970s, we've come a long way. There is no way any judge in any court in Ireland would dream, even if it was the law, which it isn't anymore, would dream of saying that a wife was like a cow or a thoroughbred horse. But that's like 60 years, 55 years. So, we're growing. So you could say that then, you can't now.
Like that say that's the 70s, so say it like 40 odd years ago, like that you're still dealing with for instance a generation that are now the parents of the younger generation, so the influences are still very much rippling in our culture, bubbling away.
Exactly.
And it shows how sort of pervasive they are. And I think that historical lens is probably useful to helping us have some degree of, I don't want to say patience, because at some point I think we should be impatient, but like the fact is a lot of this has been with us for hundreds of years, and it's very, very deep and entrenched, and we are at a precipice, I believe.
Yeah, it's very entrenched, and we have to have the patience for that. And still, on the other hand, the impact of treating people in intimate relations, failing, I suppose the shame of church and state, and not talking one church, I'm talking faiths and states all over the world, in failing to address the abuse of power in families, in private places, and in intimate relationships, means that we have to be extremely impatient as well to make sure that nobody is hurt, to ensure that people are not hurt in the way that they were by all of that. So we have to change the mindset as well, and that's going to take a bit of time. We're doing our level best, and all of us will get there. But as you say, we need to tip over to the tipping point. But then what you can do fast is you can make sure that there are adequate services. So things like that are going to be put in place, like better refuge provision. Although I often think like an answer to domestic violence that involves somebody having to leave their home to go into a refuge is kind of a very poor answer in the first place. But putting in place those services, funding rape crisis services well, having enough of them there, making sure that people have adequate access to counselling, to proper health care, all of those kind of things. They're all things that we probably could do more quickly, recognizing that these harmful attitudes are continuing to harm people this very day.
Yeah, I think at one level, a lot of it's very complex, and then at the other level, there's very practical, doable now mechanisms and actions that we could take. And I suppose this comes down in many ways to political leadership, will, and decision making, and us enforcing that or ensuring that happens without further delay.
And again, like while there's always more that needs doing, the reality is that this government has put into the programme for government that there is an epidemic of sexual, domestic and gender-based violence that needs attention. And I would expect that within the next few weeks, we will have a third national government-wide strategy to combat domestic, sexual and gender-based violence being published by Helen McEntee, but to have a whole of government approach, she has promised. I'm not revealing any secret. She's said this openly, and I don't know what's in the strategy either. Although, so it will take a little while. But I mean, there is that recognition that so far there have been efforts, but they haven't succeeded in combating that kind of intimate violence that causes such harm and that nobody wanted to know about before. It's going to take the three things. It's going to take people who are harmed having access to services. It's going to take stopping people who are doing the harm. And it's going to take then the rest of us to absolutely refuse to put up with it.
Yeah.
You know, we'll have to do that no matter how uncomfortable it is. We're going to have to do that in our workplaces, in our friends' circles, and the rest of it. Just going to have to say that's not good enough. Not good enough. Not good enough to be smearing at a private picture that you shouldn't be looking at in the first place. Not good enough to be making lewd comments about somebody. Not good enough to be wondering what a woman did to provoke her husband into hitting her. You know, we have to stop all that.
When you say we, Noeline, like, you know, I can't help thinking that at a huge level, women are already saying that. When you say we, I keep hearing that men need to, you know, I'm not wearing that as a big guilt badge or anything. I'm just thinking that that's the fundamental change when men take leadership and ownership with women.
I actually think it would take both. So, Rory, yes, absolutely. Like, men have more work to do because men are hampered by their upbringing, by the way in which they were taught you could only be a man in this one particular way. And I know there's some great work going on now in terms of being a better approach to being a man. But like, we put up with, I mean, when over all the years now, I have let things go that if I had my day back, I wouldn't maybe, or maybe in this day and age, I still possibly wouldn't want to stop a kind of a jokey conversation about somebody or other that was going on if I was at a dinner somewhere. I will, but you know, I'm still not that happy about it, you know. Yeah. So I think we can support men, but it's true that the bigger piece of work has to be done because of the way we've been wired. It's not that we're hardwired to it. The wiring has been built in a certain way that restricted us all. Yeah,
yeah. And I you used that word shame as well, that like shame is such a disabling emotion that can prevent change, because it almost is like a steel cape to hold us all down.
Yeah. And I think, and again, this isn't necessarily the most popular statement I make from time to time, but I think in terms of that as well, we will have to be careful about recognizing that you can be ashamed of things that you did in your past. You can have that, but you can also, and maybe there's nothing to be done about it. But I think to try, if this is going to work, we have to also have the generosity to say that was then and this is now, and what you thought and knew then isn't what you think and know now. So let's make it a better future. Shame is an impediment without a doubt. Now, shame is sometimes necessary as well, but it can be an impediment moving forward.
It's interesting because when I mentioned shame there, I didn't actually have in mind the perpetrators or that kind of. I actually had the survivor shame in mind, but you're right to zone in there as well, you know, and it's just shame in its entirety. But I can see why. I can see why some people do find it particularly challenging to have what you would call the generosity, because when you've been, you know, perhaps hurt at a very profound level, or there's been no justice, you know, or justice has been denied, then I suppose we can't enforce that generosity either. That's a choice that people maybe have to make. Or they don't have to make it at all.
Yeah, and where justice is being denied, that's that it's not generosity to concede your justice. I'm thinking more generally, I suppose. So in truth, for those who are denied justice, then let's make sure that they have. And sometimes that will be the court system. Sometimes it will be a clear acknowledgement by the person who caused the wrong that they know it's wrong. Restorative justice is doing a good bit of work in this area as well for people who don't see the solution as the criminal justice system. But the criminal justice system has to be available to people as well. So I'm thinking more generally about kind of the attitudes of generations before, where if people are trying to change and move on, that they are in some ways so nervous of being embarrassed and shamed that they can't move on. So we have to have good ways of doing that, but without denying people the right to be heard when they were harmed. Yeah.
Oh, Noeline, there's so much more I'd like to talk to you about, but I feel like we need to go another few hours at it. And it is, as I said, at one level very complex, and then not at all. It's some of it is so starkly simple, and we just need to get on with it. And I do feel a sense of hope about it as well, but notwithstanding the pain that is present as well for people.
Yes. Well, Rory, thanks a million. I said an awful lot now. You're a good listener. Thank you very much.
Not at all. Well,
I will just say maybe right at the end as well, Rory, that the helpline is there for anyone. You know, sometimes when I come on or we speak or something, it gets somebody thinking and they want to say something. There's a 24-hour helpline from drcc.ie will get you to it. And there's a web chat associated with it. And we now have the facility to deal with people in their own language, whatever that is, on the helpline. Because it can be a hard thing to talk about in any language, let alone a second language. So just to mention that that's there.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Noeline. And I'm sure all donations are welcome through the website and otherwise as well. But I'll make that call for you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Noeline. Thanks again.
Okay. Thanks.
Hello, Rory here again. Before you go, a reminder to please reach out for help if you need it on the issues discussed or indeed on any other issues. If you're in Ireland, visit rapecrisishelp.ie or search online for relevant helplines and services in Ireland or in your country, wherever you're listening. Also, can I ask that you might share this episode with people you think may be interested? That will help Noeline's voice and message reach many more people. Also, if you'd like to support the podcast, please consider chipping in as a once-off or a monthly patron over at loveandcourage.org. And you can support the podcast in lots of other ways. Just help it get out into the world. If you're new to the podcast, be sure to check out the archive of great conversations. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, here's to a world with more love and courage in it.